I was last speaking about cultural relativism. If we end up comparing cultures, we might end up seeing contrasts. But look at the ways in which cultural relativism may have its limits. On the one hand, it may turn out that American culture, as transmitted through motion pictures, is fairly popular, and it's certainly something that the makers of those films in Hollywood take in mind when they try to expect the return on the investment that they've made in making the movie. On the other hand, there may be a sense of skepticism or even a revulsion to American culture, so that certain types of movies may not even be shown in certain countries. The idea then of cultural scripts are talked about, and the idea of these are offered here in this chapter as examples of relative concepts associated with culture, so that certain things are not universal. Consider, as an example, sexual mores. In some cultures, women are supposed to wear garments that hide everything but their eyes. On the other hand, we may have a more liberal dress code in a different culture. You may find that in one culture, sexual mores talk about the number of partners someone can have or sexual relations in or outside of a marriage. Obviously, that can change. Finally, as an example here, consider symbolic culture, where the idea of culture relates to certain concepts expressed in symbolic form, the ways in which people end up doing things. So the example here is of cockfighting, the way in which this is seen as appropriate or representative of a certain type of a culture, where in other parts of the world it would be considered unacceptable, and in this country it would be deemed illegal. Look at symbolic culture in terms of the American pastime, as it's called, baseball, and the ways in which it's seen as so symbolic and representative of our society that you hear it talked about in an advertising commercial as being something related to hot dogs and baseball and apple pie. So there's something very primal there. Cultures may have subsets, or more clearly, subcultures. These end up having their own rules, and as compared to the larger culture, may be considered weird because they don't involve the same level of conformity. But when you look at something like the phenomena of goth kids, you'll end up seeing that in some respects that's exactly the point of being a goth, of not conforming to certain types of cultures. And that what you may end up seeing in the goth culture is that there are certain rules that exist to fit within the parameters of this kind of rebellion. Even within goth subculture, you'll end up seeing certain rules that vary, so that goth culture in different parts of the world will be expressed differently. Even in this country, you'll end up seeing the difference between Christian rock goths and hardcore goths, which seem almost like a paradox, and yet why should the goth subculture be any different from any other? That there'll be certain ways in which things are done. Look out, for example, there's supposed to be a meaningful distinction between the nerd subculture and the geek subculture. Look at the way in which culture ends up becoming expressed or reflects certain beliefs. Beliefs might end up being moral in nature and therefore rise to the level of being of value. Consider then, as an example, the American dream, what that ends up meaning, especially when it comes to people in this country, whether immigrants or people whose families have been here for generations, the ideal being of a certain measure of economic self-sufficiency, that it's achievable through certain types of efforts. You can even go back to the height of the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 19th century, where there was a series of stories that transmitted the value of the American dream, stories that were printed on poor quality paper and were cheap to buy, but were all sort of episodes or experiences of how hardworking individuals succeeded. If we see value that way, norms might end up being behaviors that would be associated with values. So if we were to go back to the example of the goth subculture, the norms may end up meaning something about certain types of attitude, certain types of expressions of attitude that you might not expect, and might not be consistent with the values of the goth subculture, that you would see goth kids, to the extent that kid is an appropriate designation of the individual who would claim to be goths, might not do something like skateboarding or tattoos. Or they might, depends on the subculture that's there. Finally, looking at the idea of culture and socialization, which is a way in which people are almost trained to be consistent with certain kinds of values, that a environment becomes tailored or modified to be able to reduce certain types of behavior. Next, the author talks about the concept of reflection theory, where you see that culture involves the projection of social structures and relationships into the public sphere. Look at the way in which we see movies communicating certain messages, so that up until the mid-60s, for example, you did not see an individual who identified as black kissing an individual who identified as white. That in 1968, it was somewhat noteworthy that on the television show Star Trek, you had the first so-called interracial kiss, which might in retrospect seem almost so trivial today as not being worthy of notice. But when that happened in 68, it was only a year after the U.S. Supreme Court had struck down laws that still existed in some states that forbade so-called interracial marriage. So these kinds of changes, and of a society that reflects these changes, come about slowly. The example that's talked about in the text talks about a current television program where you see individuals who identify as gay men having a normal family relationship. If that may be a way in which reflection theory broadly has information being disseminated in the public sphere to end up using culture to shape the behavior of individuals, Karl Marx suggested that this was a one-way street, that those with technology and the means of production would be the ones who shaped belief systems and ideologies. Remember, although the phrase might be a bit of a cliche, when you talk about communism, the means of production would be the way in which things are done. So from Marx's perspective, the people who controlled or managed the means of production, the owners, had so much power that they could end up communicating certain values, that through the working conditions they may end up saying to their workers, these are the things that are important for a work situation. You might end up therefore seeing a movie about workers in a factory marching in unison with their heads bowed as they came into a new shift if they were working on a production line, because they are to be humbled in the pursuit of their work. What Marx's ideas may not explain is why certain values and cultural products have staying power while others fall by the wayside, so that the ideas of courtly love as expressed during the Victorian era persist today, even though they seem to be somewhat falling to the wayside, that the notion of someone being a gentleman meant that that person engaged in only certain kinds of behaviors. But that also made a presumption about what it meant to be a gentleman. And so there's an anecdote related in our text that talks about the difficulty of getting people who were engaged in the practice of medicine cleaning their hands before they started the procedure, because the presumption at that time was that a gentleman always had clean hands. Whether that was true or not ended up perhaps working to the detriment of the individuals who were having the procedures committed. The fact of economic power dominating a society and therefore shaping the culture also doesn't account for why some cultural artifacts change their meaning over time. You may find that certain kinds of words or phrases, behaviors, end up changing with time. That the idea of a parlor trick essentially started out as this sort of little game that was played in a parlor, which would be a common meeting area in a house where gentlemen might be entertained or might entertain members of a family, especially if they're looking to become suitors to women in a particular family. Parlor trick now may mean, in a broader sense, any kind of a trick. While we don't really seem to have parlors any longer in houses, the fact is that the phrase maintains some kind of currency. Also, that Marx's point was that this is directional in one way, that culture ends up being a reflection or an artifact rather than something that itself ends up having a structure. The author wants to shift over, when talking about culture, to a specific manifestation of culture through the idea of media, and that media would be any kind of format that carries or presents or communicates information. Further, a distinction might be made out of a subtype of media, mass media, which ends up being the kind of media that is intended to reach the mass of the people. Take, for example, and this is the contrast that is offered here, the difference between the so-called town crier and Facebook. That at a time when print media was perhaps expensive, or rather an uncertain commodity in certain parts of the world, you might have individuals being the ones who would express the news in a community. And now when you end up seeing something like Facebook or Twitter, you'll see that any sort of event in the world comes across almost immediately there. You may very well have noticed, for example, on April 15th in the afternoon, once the bombs went off towards the finish line of the marathon, you started to see Twitter feeds of various sources end up recounting the fact that this had happened, and that some of the Twitter feeds, in fact, outpaced network television news broadcasting. In fact, that such broadcasting relied on the Twitter feeds, so that we've seen a change in which information can be disseminated through a kind of mass media. What does this mean when media ends up being something that is used to dominate or reinforce the power of dominant groups? The author uses the word hegemony to talk about the way in which this is meant to overpower a different culture. So you might have heard the phrase cultural hegemony as a way, generally a criticism, especially of American culture, to say that in some respects it's meant to overwhelm or dominate the culture of a different nation. I gave you as an example earlier American films as an example of the cultural hegemony, because the way in which they present certain values or principles, or simply because of the production quality, are deemed more superior and therefore better, that might end up being a way in which cultural hegemony is advanced. Finally, in this particular section, the author talks about domination, where you end up seeing that culture is forced on individuals. Hegemony may mean that there's a little more flexibility where people are given the opportunity to go along, but a dominant culture might, for example, say that individuals do certain things at certain times. You might see a dominant culture compelling an oath of allegiance from all individuals at a particular time, or that domination requires that individuals do certain things. When, for example, you look at of George Orwell's book 1984, our protagonist, Winston Smith, ends up, because of the dominant culture at this time, scratching out the faces of two of the individuals who are the Great Five associated with the nation's formation because they have fallen out of favor. So there's an example of dominant culture. Let me pause here and end part 3 and pick up in a second with part 4, continuing a discussion of media.